Hi, I'm Kevin. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about kitchen gear for canoe trips. Alright, so today we're going to talk about kitchen gear that you might bring on a canoe trip. This is the third video in a series of gear out videos about canoe tripping that I'm making. The first one was about how to outfit your boat. The second one was about cutting tools that you might bring on a canoe trip, and of course today we're going to talk about kitchen gear for canoe trips. So in each of these videos about gear, I'm not trying to convince you to go out and buy new gear. I'm not asking you to go get the gear that I have. On the contrary, I'm just trying to share my experiences with you. Gear is an evolution. You tend to start with simple, inexpensive stuff and get more specialized stuff as you get older and develop more experience in the backcountry. And so that's what I want to share with you today, is just some tips and tricks and some ideas and some experiences that I've had with kitchen gear on canoe trips. All right, this is an awful lot of complex gear. What we're going to do is put this away and start the discussion simple, and then we'll get more complex. All right, so what I've got here is a relatively simple set of gear. This is normally what I bring backpacking. It's not what I typically bring canoe tripping, but it's a good place to start the discussion because it gives us a frame of reference. In backpacking, you're trying to bring stuff that's very light because you're carrying everything on your back. So what I've got here is a very light LPG canister stove. The stove is very small and light. The fuel is heavy and dense, but this canister will do me for about a week. The pots that I bring are similar in their function. They are made of titanium. They're very expensive. They're very, very light. And I'll actually bring two pots. A lot of people won't. I'll bring one pot to rehydrate my meal in, another pot to boil water in. You've seen me do this in other videos. I'll rehydrate my meal. I'll grab the pot. I'll throw it in a pot cozy so that and let it rehydrate for 15 or 20 minutes, and I'll shut my stove off right away to conserve fuel. That's how I get a week out of one of these things. Bring a spoon, and that's your kit. So there's nothing at all wrong with bringing this setup on a canoe trip. This is going to be very, very functional, very, very light. Not a problem at all. Except on a canoe trip, you're generally able to bring a little more gear and provide yourself a little more comfort and function. So as an example, these stoves are very good at boiling water. They're very, very hot, but they're not great at cooking. They don't simmer very well. Similarly, these pots, these titanium pots, they're very, very light, very expensive, but they don't cook very well. Titanium is not a great conductor of heat, and so you'll get hot spots on the bottom if you're actually trying to cook a meal. So you're probably going to want to upgrade the stove and the pot system and other things, and strike the right balance between luxury and weight. So the amount of gear that you bring on a canoe trip is really going to depend on the style and your preference and the nature of that trip. Most canoe trips, I try and keep my gear down to 2 trips over a portage. If you go to 3 trips over a portage, I find, at least for me, that that takes a lot of time out of your day. So I try and aim for a total load that I can carry everything in 2 trips. So a few years ago, Carrie and I did a canoe trip that involved a number of very long portages. One was over 3 kilometers long. And so on a trip like that, we decided that we were going to try and pack light enough that we could bring everything across each portage with just one trip. And we did. And so on a trip like that, your kitchen setup is probably going to look an awful lot like this. All right, so here's a couple of stoves and some pots that I will very typically bring on a canoe trip. They do provide a little more cooking function than the simple backpacking setup. I'm going to talk about cooking on fire. I do it an awful lot. We'll do that in a minute. But it's also very practical to always bring a stove with you. Number one, you could be under a fire ban situation, in which case it might be illegal to start a fire, and so you need to bring a stove. Also, you never know when you're going to have one of those really long days. It could be raining, you get to camp late. Do you really want to go and collect firewood in the dark and light a fire and cook a meal? Or do you want to just throw your tarp up, pull out your stove, and get a hot meal going and go to bed? So on a trip, even if I plan to do most of my cooking on an open fire, I'm still going to bring a camp stove like this. So these are both white gas stoves. White gas is also known as Coleman fuel, sometimes camping fuel. Some people call it naphtha. These stoves allow you to simmer a lot better than an LPG canister stove. This is my MSR Whisper Light. It's a very old stove. I've had this for a very long time. It works pretty well. This is my Primus Omni Fuel, which I bought a number of years ago, and it's my favorite stove. It works really, really well. Some advantages: this one just has one dial to adjust the simmer. This one has two. There's a dial near the tank, and another dial right near the stove, so you can get a really good simmer with that one. I also find the Primus stove to be a little bit better construction. The pump is all metal. It's got a very good braided hose. This one, the MSR Whisper Light, everything is plastic. The pump is plastic, so that could break on you. It's probably not. I've had this for a long time, but it could break on you. The housing here is plastic, and you can see this one's got a little bit of a crack in it, which I just noticed now. So, you know, this one's going to last you a lot longer. So this stove has a really interesting aftermarket feature that I've added. These stoves can be quite loud, and some people don't like that, and so I experimented with this feature right here. This is a silencing cap. It's made by a cottage industry company called Bernie Dog. This is the Omni Dog. All his products are named after dogs. This fits right into the stove, and when you light the stove, it really reduces the volume, the noise volume that comes from the stove. It's kind of a cool feature, and I've noticed that Primus and other companies are starting to make these themselves. So I think that's very cool, something you might consider. Not something really necessary, but it's a really neat feature. So if you're going to bring a stove that is better suited to cooking, you might as well bring a pot set that matches that function. This is what I typically bring on most canoe trips. These are my GSI anodized aluminum pots. They've got these lids which double as frying pans. And they've got a pot gripper that allows you to pick up the pot like so. Very common in outdoor gear to have pot grippers. These came black, and I painted them yellow so that I don't lose them around the campsite. The good thing about anodized aluminum is that aluminum is a much better conductor of heat than the titanium pots. So they're going to be a lot better to cook with. Aluminum will disperse the heat more evenly. You're less likely to have hot spots on the bottom, and that's going to result in a better cooking pot. Very, very simple. I've had these a long time. They've really held up. So I think these are a really great investment for anyone who's going to own their own pots and do backcountry canoe tripping. These do have a separate lid which doubles as a frying pan. I have used it as a frying pan, but I generally prefer to bring a purpose built frying pan. This frying pan is also made by GSI. It's just a little bit heavier, it's a little bit wider, it has a folding handle. I cook on the fire with this quite a bit. This is great. I always bring this if I'm going to be catching fish on a trip or expect to be catching fish. So I think aluminum really is your best option for a backcountry pot set. They're fairly light. They do disperse heat very well and provide good cooking. These ones have a non-stick surface, which is really, really nice for cleanup. One problem with aluminum, though, is it is prone to dents and dings, and so if you're going to be rough with your stuff, you might consider another option, and that option would be stainless steel. I don't use these very much. We owned these a long time ago. They're a little bit less expensive than aluminum. And this is a choice of youth groups and outfitters and that kind of thing because they're a little more resistant to dents and dings. They don't cook quite as well as aluminum, but in terms of cleanup, they're not non-stick, but you can throw some sand in here and really give it a good scrub without wrecking it. So again, this is a good option if you expect to be in a situation where you're going to be giving your pots and pans a lot of abuse. All right, so that's a pretty good discussion about pots and stoves. Let's move on to some of the utensils and other accessories that you might bring on a canoe trip. All right, so this is a very typical array of some of the kitchen accessories that I would bring on a canoe trip. I've really changed my practices with regard to this kind of stuff. I used to bring an awful lot of stuff, spoons and ladles and a spice kit, and I just found over time that less is more. I've just changed my packing practices. If I need spices for a meal, I'm going to pack those spices in the meal. I've just found that's a lot easier, especially when you're trying to clean up and pack up in the morning and make good time. So let's take a look at what I have here. For cleanup, I've got a very small scrubber. It's cut down from the original size. That's all you need, even on a long 2 or 3 week trip. That'll last you. I also bring soap. This is biodegradable soap. It's repackaged in a smaller container because all you need is a couple of drops for each meal. In terms of a spice kit, this is all I bring. This is a very small pepper grinder. I believe this is made by GSI. You just pull off the bottom cap and it's a pepper grinder just like you have at home. Pepper does taste better when it's freshly ground, and so that's a little extravagance, and I find it's worth the weight and the size. I'll always bring a spare fork if someone loses theirs or whatever, or breaks theirs. That can be a little bit handy when cooking, and certainly a spare spoon just to stir the meal. Very, very handy. I'll bring a small whisk. This whisk folds up kind of nicely. You adjust this here, and it can go from round to relatively flat for packing, so that's kind of handy. That's great for if you're making any sort of baked item, or for fish batter. This is kind of handy to have. You can always use a fork. I'll bring one of 2 of these spatulas usually. These are made by MSR. They're just I think Teflon spatulas. They work great. This one folds, which is kind of handy. It packs a little bit smaller. And most times I'll bring this. This is a cheese grater. It's got a little protective cover on it. It's very sharp. This is made by GSI. I'll often have a meal or 2 or 3 or 4 on a trip that a bit of Parmesan cheese goes really good with. So I'll bring a small brick of Parmesan cheese, and I'll use this to grate the cheese onto the meal. So finally, let's talk about cooking on an open fire. There's a ton of ways to do this. If you're into bushcraft, you probably know a bunch of ways that you can suspend a pot over a fire. You can even immerse a pot or a pan right onto a fire, as long as you're careful that it doesn't spill over. But you know what? The best tip I have for anyone who's going to be going out and cooking on an open fire on a canoe trip is to get yourself a good grill. This is my grill. This is the Voyageur's grill, made by Purcell Trench. That's the name of the company. Another great little cottage industry company. This is titanium, so it's very light, easy to pack. It gets dirty in the fire, so it's got this great travel bag to keep the rest of your stuff clean. It's very, very light. They're not cheap, but you know what? This one's lasted me a long time. This has lasted about 10 years. It's a great grill. What I'll do is I'll just put it on some rocks or even some green wood, and then I'll put my pots on top of that. And this is just the right size for 1 or 2 people, or even a small group of people to cook on. Just make a nice little fire underneath and you're all set. So before I invested in this grill, I used to use replacement barbecue grills that you can find at hardware stores. They're relatively cheap, 20 or 30 bucks you can get a grill, but they're going to be a lot heavier than this. And they're going to get your stuff dirty because they don't come in a nice travel bag. And you know what? They don't last very long. I find they get weak from the heat of a fire. I guess the fire must be a lot hotter than most barbecues, and they tend to develop weak spots and bend. And the most I've ever gotten out of one of those was 2 or 3 years. So I've really found this to be worth the investment. There's also some other cheaper camping grills on the market, but this one has lasted me a long time, and I've really found it a worthwhile investment. So another great thing to have in your kitchen kit for a canoe trip is a billy can, a billy pot to boil water in. I've got a couple here. These are the Morse pots, designed by Morris Kohansky, a very famous bushcrafter and survival instructor. He designed this pot. He considered this pot to be perfect for 1 or 2 people, and I would agree with that. What makes it perfect? Well, it's taller than it is wide, and so it hangs very, very well over a fire. It stays very well balanced. It's got a very narrow spout here that you can easily pour water with, but it's also not too narrow that you're going to spill stuff or get junk inside. The lid fits nicely. It opens and closes very nicely. Some lids you kind of have to pull and pry them apart, so it's got a very easily opening and closing lid. The top of the lid has this little bail which you can fold up like this so it doesn't heat as much, so you can still use your fingers to open it when the pot's hot. And it's got these nice folding handles in the back here that allow you to tip this nicely. So I do consider it an ideal pot. I've got two sizes here. This is the 1.8 liter size, which I find great for 1 or 2 people. And this is the 1.1 liter, which I don't think has as much utility because of the size. You can tell I don't use it as much. It's not as dirty as the big one. This one is great for 1 or 2 people for boiling water, for cleaning, or for making hot drinks. With a bigger group, this loses utility. When I bring this with my family on day trips and we boil up some hot chocolate in the winter, this really isn't big enough for 5 people. This is probably a 3 or 4 person pot max to get one good drink out of. So it's great for 1 or 2 people. So this is the 1.1 liter pot. Again, doesn't have as much utility as the bigger pot. I make coffee in this. I make cowboy style coffee. This is an awful lot of coffee for 1 person, and pretty good for 2 people. 2 people will get about a cup and 3/4 each out of one of these. Unfortunately, the Moore's pots, despite their perfection, are no longer available. They used to be sold by a small company called 4 Dog Stove, but you can no longer find them on their website. There are, however, other similar pots out there on the market. So last big subject here, let's talk about baking in the backcountry. This is something that's a little bit elusive for some folks. I've been baking in the backcountry for quite a while, and I'm going to start by showing you one of the first contraptions that I've ever used. It was for baking on a stove like this. It's the Outback oven. It involved using a scorch buster like this that would sit on your stove that diffuses the flames and creates a bit of a gap between that and the baking vessel. This came with a bit of a pizza pan kind of thing, but I found that almost any pot will work fine for that. Then you'd put your dough, your bannock, your bread, whatever you were going to bake inside of here, and then you would cover this with this reflective fire-resistant shroud that would hold all the heat in and bake your food. It had a little hole in the top to let out excessive heat, and that was pretty important because it would get very, very hot in there. You would really want to manage your flame. So these work pretty well. I've had a number of these and over a number of years, and you know what, I was pretty happy with them. They did a fairly good job of baking. Sometimes a little too hot, sometimes you get some burning on the bottom, but it was my introduction to baking in the backcountry. The Outback oven, though, is, however, discontinued. You can't find this anymore. I think one of the reasons might be safety. I'm not sure, but it gets very, very hot under here, and you want to make sure that your fuel bottle is away from that heat source. So I'm not positive of this, but one of the big risks would be is if someone doesn't understand what's going on here and they choose to use this stove system on an LPG canister stove, because when you set it up like this, you're going to be directing an awful lot of heat down towards that fuel bottle, and there's a risk of explosion. Might be one of the reasons it's now discontinued. So when I learned that the Outback oven was discontinued, I tried experimenting with different things, and one of the things I found is the billy can. If you put your billy can on a stove, you're going to create a nice warm space and essentially an oven, but it's got the same problem. The bottom is going to get really hot. So again, you want to create some space. So the first thing you want to do is find a baking vessel that'll fit inside. So this is a nice little 4-inch anodized aluminum baking pan that I found at a specialty baking store. It fits nicely inside the pot with about 1 inch all around. And for creating space between the bottom of the pot and this, you could use almost anything. Some rolled up aluminum foil, you could cut a section of pipe. I found this is my windscreen from my LPG canister stove. It's about 3/4 of an inch thick, and so I can put that in the bottom. I can then put my bread or bannock or whatever inside of here, put that in the pot, and then put the lid on. You light your stove, and the key here is patience. You want to wait 35-40 minutes without removing the lid for that bread to bake on a very low simmer. If you have that patience, it'll come out great. Your crust will be nice and dark. If you open this lid early and peek like I like to do, it won't be as dark. So there's an awful lot of ways to bake inside of a billy can. If you search YouTube, you'll find lots of videos. Most folks don't use a stove. In most videos, you'll see a billy can used on a bed of coals. Maybe they'll stack some coals on top to create heat source from the bottom and the top and bake inside. That's an awful lot like a Dutch oven. Most Dutch ovens are too heavy to bring on a canoe trip because they're made of cast iron. I've got one here that isn't. It's made of aluminum and it's quite light. It's a Dutch oven, all right. It's designed to be put on a bed of coals, and it's got this nice lid with a lip so that you can stack coals on top and create that heat source on top. So this is made by GSI. It's 10 inches in diameter. It's anodized aluminum. It's fairly lightweight, but it has yet to make it on a canoe trip with me. It's been on lots of car camping trips. I just find it just a little bit too heavy to bake in when I've got one last option, and I'll show you that next. So if I'm going on a longer canoe trip, 1, 2, or even 3-week trip, I'm more likely going to want to do some baking somewhere along the trip. So this is what I would reach for if I was doing that. This is my reflector oven. This is designed to be set up beside a fire. The heat from the fire will radiate inside and reflect off the surface down onto this rack. And I'll put a baking vessel in there to capture all that heat and do some baking. This stove is made by Svante Freden. It's spelled 2 different ways in the back here, and I'm terrible about Scandinavian pronunciations. It's a really great stove. They're certainly in the business of selling these. You can certainly go online and buy them. But what I find really interesting about this company is that they offer the plans for this stove for free on the same website. So you can grab the PDF. If you're handy in sheet metal, this is a very easy stove to make just by following their plans. So I find that really cool that they sell these but also give away the plans for free. So I really like this oven. It's got a great handle for moving it around when it's hot. You'll usually want to prop it up with some wood or a rock to give it the right angle so that the grill is level. And it folds up really, really well. You just pull out the grill, the rack, and you fold down the back, little latch there. That folds down. The sides fold inward. You put the rack back inside, and it collapses right down to almost nothing. Very, very easy to pack, very, very light, and it comes with this nice strap that you can keep it all together with. So because this is a lot lighter than the Dutch oven, this is what I usually bring on a canoe trip for baking. So this is the pan that I use most often for baking in the backcountry. This is a small 5-inch anodized aluminum pan that I got at a specialty baking store. I like a small pan like this because I like to minimize leftovers. Most home recipes for baking that you have are designed to fit 2 8 or 9 inch round cake pans or a 9 by 13 rectangular cake pan, and that's going to give you an awful lot of leftovers. In my opinion, too many leftovers for a canoe trip. Even with a large group of people, 4 or 6 people, you're not going to eat that whole recipe in one sitting. So I like to scale my recipes down so that they fit inside of here, and that way I minimize leftovers. You're going to be able to eat all of this in one sitting, or at least minimize your leftovers and have a snack the next day. You're not going to be trying to manage leftovers in a food barrel. So the last piece of gear I want to talk about is this, a very simple piece of gear, a simple plastic wash basin. Not essential. It's really easy to wash pots and pans without this. But as your group size gets bigger, if you have more bowls and cutlery and pots and pans, it's nice to be able to use this to wash in. This one's a little bit dirty because everything I've been handling today is a little bit sooty. But this just provides another little bit level of function. You can also use this to knead bread or bannock in. I find it very handy for that. So this looks like it takes up an awful lot of room in your pack, but it doesn't. I was lucky and found one that is small enough to fit just inside a blue plastic barrel. So what I'll do is I'll fill my barrel and I will invert this and put it on top and then seal the barrel. And in that way it takes up very, very little room. So once again, to wrap up, what you bring for kitchen gear on a canoe trip is going to depend on your style of travel, your personal preferences. This is what works for me. There are other styles out there, other types of gear that you can use, and there's no right or wrong answer. It is what works for you and what you enjoy to use in the backcountry. All right, guys, thanks for watching. I hope you got something out of this. If you did, please hit like, share, and subscribe. As always, I hope you find some time to get outdoors and have a great day.